Okay, so before we get into the video, this is just one of my favorite bits of marketing that I've ever seen. It's 1995, E3. Sega and Sony are given their keynote presentations for the upcoming Sega Saturn and the Sony Playstation. And Sega tried to come out swinging. What they actually tried to do was shadow drop the Sega Saturn. They got up and said that the Sega Saturn would be available immediately at select retailers for a retail price of $3.99. And they thought this would be a good way to get out in front of the competition, take the market share from Nintendo and Sony, who was about to bring their own console to market. However, next came the guy from Sony, and evidently he had this great big speech planned, highlighting all the great things about the Sony PlayStation. But after seeing that presentation, he just threw it all away, and this is what happened.
$2.99.
Oh man, it's like Sega threw a huge roundhouse punch and walked right into a counter punch. That's just, oh man, you can't make that up. So beautiful. Alright, how do you do, folks? So it's the month of June, and if you guys remember last year, I did a console retrospective for the Sega Saturn, continuing a tradition that I had going from my days as a blogger on Tumblr. And after swimming in the murky yet surprisingly pleasant waters of the Sega Saturn, I thought that it was time to venture into the crystal clear waters of the Sony PlayStation. So how the PlayStation actually came about is a really interesting story. In the early 90s, one of the big innovations in the video game space was the advent of the compact disc, the CD-ROM. It must have seemed like black magic for developers at the time, because not only were these things cheaper to produce than cartridges, which was the standard format at the time, but they could hold far more data than a cartridge could. So because of that, developers just started trying to push the new format as much as possible. The first company to do this would be NEC with the PC Engine CD, which we know here in the States as the TurboGrafx 16 CD. And not too long after that, Sega would announce their own CD add-on for the Sega Genesis. With seeing the games that were coming out for these consoles, Nintendo started to get concerned. So what they started doing was enter into negotiations with various third parties about producing a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, which was starting to hit a decline at the time, and they wanted to stay ahead of the game by adopting a new format. However, as the deal started to go down, Nintendo realized that the deal that they were making with Sony, who they ended up going with, was not terribly favorable to them. They realized that the manufacturing of games would fall on Sony, which would really cut into Nintendo's profit margin, as they basically made money on selling cartridges to publishers. But they also realized that the CD technology might have been a little too young for the console market. While there were some great games on the PC Engine CD and the Sega CD, most of the games tended to just be, FMV heavy games and had some really slow load times as well. This is primarily because quality CD drives at the time were incredibly expensive. So that's just something you had to eat if you wanted to keep the cost of the add-ons down. Because of that, Nintendo decided that they were going to pull out of the deal, and unfortunately they did it in the worst possible way imaginable. Rather than just back out of the deal very slowly, they opted to announce to the world that they had entered into a deal for a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo with Philips as opposed to Sony at the very same trade show that Sony was planning to announce the Sony Playstation, which at the time was going to be the add-on for the Super Nintendo. The deal with Philips would eventually fall apart, and that would blow up in Nintendo's face too, as that's how you got the infamous CDI Zelda games, which are still considered to be some of the worst video games of all time. However, a couple of bad video games on a console that nobody bought is an embarrassment to be sure, but it's nowhere near as bad as what happened next. Frustrated and humiliated by Nintendo, Sony decided that they would take everything that they had prepared for Nintendo and would apply it to their own console, and they would eventually release it as the Sony Playstation. When the PlayStation was about to hit the scene, I have a feeling a lot of people were skeptical of it because it was a new console entering the scene as opposed to the two from Nintendo and Sega, who were the dominant forces in the industry at the time. But everything just worked out for Sony at the time. For starters, they had the sense to primarily build the console for 3D gameplay. One of the things I mentioned several times during the Sega Saturn retrospective was that Sega had developed the Saturn primarily for 2D, and when they heard that Sony was building the PlayStation for 3D, they hastily reworked the chipset to accommodate 3D. Thus, the PlayStation could do really complex 3D, while the Sega Saturn could barely do 3D at all. And considering 3D was a hot new thing at the time, that just made for better business. It also helped that the PlayStation was much easier to program for. While the Sega Saturn and Sega always touted its multi-chip setup, it made the console very difficult to program for because he had to know how to get all the chips working in tandem to squeeze the most out of it. The PlayStation was far easier to program for, and in addition to that, it was very cheap to program for too. It was a CD-based console, the CDs were very cheap, and this was especially in comparison to the Nintendo 64, which still used cartridges. And as a result, it was far more expensive to put out a game on that than it was on the Sony PlayStation. With all that in mind, the PlayStation would just do gangbusters at retail. To this day, the PlayStation is one of the best-selling consoles of all time, selling a staggering 103 million units worldwide, and having one of the longest lifespans for any video game console, period. A lot of people don't realize this, but the PlayStation was supported clear up until 2006, right before the PlayStation 3 came out. And reportedly, there were over 4,000 games made for it. Now, I don't know how accurate that number is, but it wouldn't surprise me considering how eager people were to get games out on this thing. So, yeah, the PlayStation, it really was humongous for its day. And, there is just so much to cover, lots of great games in this library, and I'm really excited to share everything that I found on it. So, I hope you guys will join me over the next month or so as I present to you all my PlayStation retrospective. And close this out, we gotta show the prompt, don't we?